Hi, I'm Mary Ellen Lepionka, and my talk today is about the Algonquians, the Native Americans who lived here, and how they made their living here, both seasonally as gatherers and as hunters and gardeners on Cape Ann in particular. And I have about 68 slides that take about an hour, so I hope you'll be able to stay with me. I'll be glad to respond to any questions via email, and my email address is on the screen. Um, and these are the questions that I hope to address in this talk. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What were they doing here? What plants were they using and why? What were they growing? And how were they practicing their agriculture and horticulture? And how did they use what they gathered and grew? This is quite a lot. And so, what I have to say is only just some examples. The people who lived on Cape Ann at the time of European contact and well before were the Pawtucket. They were a branch of the Pennacook people of the lower Merrimack Valley of New Hampshire. Some of the colonists called them the Agawam Indians, after the name of one of their major villages, which is in Ipswich. This map shows some of their allies, and their enemies were the Eastern Abenaki and the Iroquois. The Eastern Abenaki would raid them for corn, for example. All the people named on that map, except for the Iroquois, are all Algonquians. Algonquians is the name of a language family. And Algonquian speaking people were the first people to occupy the Atlantic seaboard from the Arctic Circle to Chesapeake Bay. These were the largest Pennacook and Pawtucket villages at the time of contact, as recorded incorrectly by the English. These villages represent a population of about 12,000 people. Seasonal Algonquian villages look like this painting, which is of Shattuck Farm in Andover, archaeological reconstruction based on evidence there. That would be around 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. And the different wigwam construction styles show how different families and bands would come to join together at certain times of the year. About 1,000 years after this same site during the Middle Woodland period would have had many more wigwams, more spread out, with kitchen gardens attached to them and with some acreage planted in maize. And we can see that in Samuel de Champlain's drawing of Gloucester Harbor. You can see all the wigwams, the dome-shaped things, with some of them have smoke coming out of the smoke holes. And there are their corn patches on the southwest-facing sides of their wigwams. Each wigwam has the kitchen garden in its front yard. Here in Gloucester, the Pawtucket had cornfields in Riverdale, along Mill River, and the terrace above the harbor. The original name of Middle Street was Cornhill Street. And archaeological evidence shows that people have been making a living here on Cape Ann for at least 10,000 years or more. They were seasonal migrants during most of that time. They were hunting, fishing, digging clams, hunting seals, quarrying stone. They would gather mussels and seabird eggs, feathers, and shells. And then around 750 or 800 years ago, they started establishing agricultural villages, including the one here in Gloucester, which we called Wanasquam. And they were able to do this because of the richness and diversity of the subsistence resources here. The people were able to live year here, year round because of the means of making a living in these three basic bioregions. This area has a concentration of resources in wetlands, uplands, and estuaries, all in close proximity. The carrying capacity of Cape Ann environment would still support at least 3,000 people today at a subsistence level. The Pawtucket maintained a mixed economy. They did not specialize in anything, but because there was so much here, other people specialized in corn, for example, the more inland people. But here on the coast, there was no need to specialize. They made total use of the environment in all seasons. And they also had an extensive trading network with other people all up and down the coast and as far west as the Great Lakes. Today, we hardly are aware of all of the wild resources for making a living that are still all around us. And that's what I got interested in and started to do research on. I discovered that almost everything you see in a wetland is edible, useful as medicine or as fiber. Just about everything you lay your eyes on. For example, arrowhead plants have edible tubers, and they were gathered and peeled and roasted. They were known as Indian potatoes. They were gathered in late spring. They were a basic survival food after the privations of winter. We have lots of arrowhead plants. Other important tubers included the Jerusalem artichoke, which was cultivated and harvested in late summer, and potato-like ground nuts, which are basically the roots of wild beans that were gathered on upland hillsides in the fall. That's Apios americana. Jerusalem artichokes are identified by their cheery yellow flowers. And if you have some of these growing wild on your property, it was undoubtedly the site of a Pawtucket garden. The strings of potato-like ground nuts are identifiable by an above-ground edible wild bean, which you can still find here on Cape Ann. It was an important survival food for the Indians and the colonists alike. The Abenaki name for ground nuts is panak, and it may be the origin of the place name for Pennacook. Here are abundant ground nuts. Water lily bulbs were a spring survival food. Every part of the water lily plant is edible. You just want to wash the leaves and the flowers very well before you add them raw to your salad. And you cook the stems and the bulbs. The swamp dogwood on the left in this background picture was a source for arrow shafts, lashing. So there were fiber and wood products that were important from dogwood. But the inner bark of the swamp dogwood contains very high concentrations of quinine, which is a remedy for parasitic diseases and fevers and muscle cramps. Dogwood bark mixed with resin from coniferous trees makes an antiseptic to apply to wounds. And the flowers and berries of dogwood are edible, though bitter. And they are also used to make a red dye. And this was one of the things I found most interesting in my studies, and that was that there are a great many plants that had multiple uses. Different parts of a plant would have different uses, and they also had different uses at different times of the year. So many of the plants are very multi-purpose, as you'll see. The picture also has canary grass. I think the ones in the picture are an invasive, but there is a native canary grass, and the Algonquians collected the seeds of wild edible grasses to add to their grain mixtures. This was a hedge against corn crop failure to have a supply of wild grains that could be made into flour and baked into loaves. Here are some examples of wetland food plants. Northern wild rice, I was interested to learn, still grows in the Ipswich River and in the Parker River. People have found it for me in their canoes up in the tributaries. And the picture shows how the Indians harvested it by holding it over the gunwales of their canoe and paddling it so that the kernels would fall into the canoe, and then the plant was released to continue growing. The people collected grains from maygrass and wild buckwheat, as well as wild rice, as part of their reserves of grain. Cattails were an all-purpose resource. All parts of the plant are used in different seasons. The people ate the tubers and the shoots in the spring, cooked like vegetables. You could add cattail leaves to your weavings and to your smoking mixtures. And the tubers were dried and ground into flour for baking. The pollen cones could be added to dishes and dyes. The pollen heads were used as firebrands, and the burst fluff was stored as insulating material. Ferns were a spring vegetable. The raspberry is multi-purpose. The edible berries were eaten fresh, and also were dried into raisins, as were all the berries, to be added to many recipes. Raspberry juice makes a syrup and a dye. Brewed raspberry leaves were an all-purpose medicinal tea. And the boiled roots and stems of raspberry plants were used in basket weaving. So there's a good example of a multi-purpose plant. The chokecherries were among the first fruits to ripen in the spring. The bark of the chokecherry root was used to treat the common cold. And the people made jams and leathers with the berries. They also added the shavings of chokecherry inner bark to their smoking mixtures. The people sauteed and ate maple seeds and birch seeds as delicacies. And they made syrups from the saps to sweeten dishes. A lot of the native foods, while edible, are not very palatable. And they often had to have sweeteners or other ingredients added to them to make them palatable. You can't always go by taste. There are some things that are really very, very good for you that don't taste very good. Cranberries were so important that the Algonquians held an annual cranberry harvest festival, most of them. The berries, the paste, the juice, or the fermentation of this wetland fruit could be added to any dish. The berries are high in vitamin C, as you no doubt know. The whole plant is strongly antibacterial. It was used to prevent urinary tract infections and stomach ulcers. These are some medicinal plants from the wetland area. As I mentioned, dogwood bark and roots are antiseptic and antimalarial. And teas made from the inner bark of willow trees reduces fever and relieves pain. The bark of willows and trees, some of the trees in the other biomes, such as slippery elms, contain concentrations of a compound similar to aspirin. The people also used fresh willow twigs as a kind of toothbrush, a dentifrice. Witch hazel seeds were a delicacy, and the bark is strongly anti-inflammatory. It was made into a tincture and is still used as a tincture and a tea to treat skin ailments, both internally and externally. It's a remedy for poison ivy and eczema. And an infusion of the flowers of gold thread, which is shown in the background photo, Coptis trifolia, made a mouthwash for curing cankers and sores in the mouth. Joe Pye weed, which is known by various names. Let's see. I guess I want to move that. There we go. This Joe Pye weed has several medicinal properties, but was especially used for kidney stones, gallbladder, gravel, urinary tract problems. Some of these other plants come up. These are some examples. speedwell or brookline, which is in the Veronica family. All the Veronicas were all-purpose remedies. You could clear sinus infections, ease eye strain. It was used as a liniment for muscle strain, and as a lotion for the skin. Dried speedwell flowers are still added to herbal teas to treat cough and sore throat. The native people used infusions of the whole plant to reduce stomach inflammations and to prevent ulcers. Skunk cabbage is poisonous. The shamans collected the sprouts in spring and ate them raw as a hallucinogen to achieve out-of-body experiences. Most hallucinogens come from plants that are deadly if not prepared and used properly. For example, nightshade is a poison, like skunk cabbage, but in moderation, it is also strongly anti-inflammatory. It's a muscle relaxant and a pain reliever, and it was given, the Algonquians gave it to women to ease the pain of childbirth. Native medicine was specialized for treating wounds and infections, digestive and bowel problems, inflammation and joint pain, parasites, and menstrual and childbirth pain. About 40% of the USP formulary today for medicines are Native American in origin. You've probably seen wild cucumbers and these are other wetland plants. You probably didn't recognize them because of the spines, but you just take off the spines and peel the skin, and there you have a delicious fruit inside a cucumber. Wild lettuce is delicious while young, but the sap of the mature plants is a strong alkali. It was used as an emetic, an analgesic, and a sedative drug. So the timing for collecting and using wild resources is very important. Yarrow and yew are examples of plants with essential oils that the people used medicinally. For example, as a sedative, or to reduce fever, or to treat respiratory ailments. If you gather those red yew berries and pound them into a paste, they make an excellent remedy for burns. And women sometimes drank tea from the berries as a form of contraception. Yew bark is used today in cancer treatment. The Algonquians did not have cancer per se as a diagnosis, but they nevertheless benefited from consuming decoctions of yew bark. Wetland fiber plants include dogbane or Indian hemp, stinging nettle, and milkweed. The stems were harvested for fibers that could be twisted into string. And fiber crafts were essential for most economic activities: fishing line, nets, traps, rope, twine, woven cloth, and so on, all needed fiber. Needed fiber to haft stone tools onto handles and so on. Milkweed was also a very important food plant, believe it or not. All parts of the milkweed plant are edible in season. The shoots in spring, the unopened pods in summer, cooked like a vegetable. Medicine from the roots and sap in the fall, especially for lung problems. Then the dried pods were collected for winter fire starters. And then the burst silk was collected for insulating material. Also, all the above ground parts of the nettle plant are edible and nutritious when cooked as a vegetable. Who knew? So that was the wetland bioregion. The resources from the upland bioregions provided all important tree products and all the fruits and berries that grow in the understories of the forest. Indigenous people had uses for the outer and inner bark of trees, their roots and branches, sap, pine needles, candles, nuts, cones. They cleared the forest through controlled fires on very gently sloping uplands. All the southwest facing hills, gentle hills, were cleared of trees in order to plant corn. Uh, and the colonists were very surprised to find vast tracts of deforested land with Indian plantations when they first sighted the continent. All of the tree products had very special uses. Spruce roots were used for bowstrings and laces. A tea made from spruce needles was used medicinally. Spruce and pine have very high concentrations of vitamin C in their needles. Tree resins were applied to burns and used to cover wounds while they heal, to protect them while they heal. Pine pitch was collected. The native people burned pitch in lamps. They used the resin in arrow making. They used it to waterproof their baskets and to waterproof their moccasins. It was used to glue things together and to protect wounds. And pines also provided pollen heads for firebrands and pine nuts. Now, the Algonquians often left after they did their controlled burns, summer and fall. They would leave the burned pine cones on the ground as a winter fodder for deer. They relied on deer and, wherever possible, provided habitat for deer near their settlements. They used the bark of the eastern white oak for winter wigwam coverings, and oak trees were also regarded as sacred. And arborvitae and cedars that are in the thuja family have important medicinal uses. Birch bark, of course, was preferred for containers, boxes, and canoes, famous birch bark canoe, for which yellow birch was preferred to paper birch. These upland food plants still grow here. Honey locust pods flavor savory stews. Concord grapes, as well as all the berries, were dried to raisins. They added those to porridges, puddings, cakes, and minced meat, pemmicans. Gooseberry tea soothes the throat and sore eyes. Tea made from gooseberry bark was a way to get rid of intestinal worms. Every spring, children would be dosed with gooseberry tea. All the many varieties of the native Amelanchier berries, the service berries, June berries, and shad, they were delicacies to them. They made fruit leathers, and they added berries to everything. These berries, along with others, along with strawberries, blackberries, and currants, are all native to New England. We often don't realize that common foods like these berries also have medicinal uses. Strawberry leaves are a strong diuretic, for example. Blueberries contain a powerful antioxidant and are especially beneficial for eye health. Teas made from blueberry leaves and stems are also diuretic, and elderberry reduces inflammation. It was used to treat wounds and also to treat colic in babies. Elderberry syrup today is still taken for colds and allergies and for urinary tract and bladder infections. The elderberry plant, however, is toxic. Only the flowers and the ripe berries are edible. And in the picture in the inset, these black huckleberries are on Pole Hill in Gloucester. Some of these plants, again, were multi-purpose. As I mentioned, strawberry leaves were diuretic, also an astringent and a laxative. Dock in the rumex family had edible leaves in spring, and then the ripe seeds were collected in fall to grind and mix with other grains into flour. Bedstraw seeds can be roasted and boiled to make a kind of coffee. And the leaves had medicinal use. If you've had any experience with bedstraw in your garden, you know that it's a nuisance. It grows all over everything, and it's sticky, sticky and springy. Uh, the English used it to stuff their mattresses, hence the name bedstraw. But the Algonquians encouraged the growth of bedstraw because it was a favorite forage of deer. And if you have a problem with bedstraw in your garden, you may be sharing a site that was once a habitation site for Native people. Native knotweed, which is Polygonum cognatus and not the invasive Japanese knotweed, uh, had edible leaves and seeds. The seeds were harvested in fall to add to grain mixtures. Smartweed is another plant in the Polygonum family. It has leaves and seeds that are hot like chili peppers, and they were added to grain mixtures to make them spicy. Catalpas that are in the backyard background photo are also multi-purpose. They were known as Indian bean trees. The pods and seeds are not really edible as a food. It's a medicinal plant mainly. The bark of the catalpa contains quinine. The leaves were used as a poultice on wounds and abrasions. You can make a tea from the catalpa seeds to treat asthma or bronchitis. And the pods are strongly sedative and may stimulate the heart, but are mainly very sedative. These upland medicinal plants still grow here. Sassafras is an analgesic pain reliever, also used for gout and arthritis and as a tonic. The root makes sarsaparilla. The colonists exported it as a cure for syphilis. The sassafras tree in the inset photo is beside the Pawtucket rock shelter that is on Thompson Mountain here in Gloucester. Juniper berries were poulticed to apply to wounds and painful joints. And infusion was taken to treat kidney stones and gestational diabetes. Juniper oil was heated and inhaled to numb pain and treat respiratory ailments. And the berries were also used in fermentation. White cedar is another plant in the thuja family with important uses. It was used as a tea, an ointment, a tincture, a volatile oil, for everything from inducing labor to removing warts. Cedar was sacred and used in ritual practice. They used cedar boughs to line sleeping platforms, storage pits, and burial shrouds. Native women sweetened their wigwam interiors with cedar boughs in the winter and with sweet pepperbush boughs in the summer. Inkberries and the berries of other native ilex or holly are edible, as well as bunchberries, which are in the dogwood family. Inkberry, as the name implies, also makes a dye, a black dye. Slippery elm bark was used to cure everything from menstrual cramps to kidney stones. A decoction of the inner bark of slippery elm taken internally reduces fever and inflammation. And for a quick cure in a pinch, you can medicate yourself by just cutting away a little patch of the outer bark of a slippery elm tree and licking the inner bark. These plants are also native to New England. Hawthorn is a multi-use tree. Indigenous people used all parts of it as edible in some form or as medicine. The leaves and flowers can be added to salads. The antioxidant vitamin-rich berries could be added to batters for baking. You can make teas, tinctures, and syrups from the roots and bark to treat heart conditions. Hawthorn was given to heartsick people as well as to people with symptoms of heart disease. Bee balm, move this down. Uh, Bee balm or monarda, um, also known as bergamot, has edible leaves, raw or cooked. A tea made from the flowers and leaves treats colds and flu. It's also good for nausea and indigestion. Valerian is a well-known substance for treating nervous disorders, also pain, also insomnia. A commercial variety of valerian is in use today in herbal teas. The root could be also roasted as a vegetable, dried for tobacco mixtures, burned for incense, and used as an insect repellent. Passion flower is another stress reliever, pain reliever, and sleep aid. Indigenous people ate the passion flower fruits as a delicacy and used all parts of the plant medicinally. Hemlock is poisonous. Socrates allegedly died from a tea made from an infusion of hemlock needles. But the Algonquians also used it in moderation for anxiety, hypertension, and spasms. It acts as a tranquilizer and muscle relaxant. It was given to women to ease the pain of childbirth. Acorns of the white oak or staple food. These are the oaks that have the leaves with rounded edges. You do not want to try to eat the nuts of the red oak, which have the spiky leaves. Even with the less bitter variety of quercus, the acorn still had to be rinsed and cooked in multiple changes of water to remove the husks and to leach out all the tannins. The nut meats were then dried and crushed to make a protein powder. The protein powder was used to augment baby food. And you could also bake the flour into cakes as trail food or as a high protein winter survival food in case of corn crop failure. Steamed hickory bark eased headaches. Poultices soaked in a decoction of the bark was good for muscles, painful muscles and joints. And of course, the hickory nuts are absolutely delicious in foods and were used as a sweetener. In addition to the wetland and the upland biomes, we also have estuaries. Almost everything you see in an estuary is edible or useful as medicine or as fiber. Estuary bioregions are the bays that are formed by the drowning of river mouths in sea level rise, which has been happening since the end of the last ice age. These are the places where freshwater and saltwater mix. The diverse environments in estuaries include tidal rivers, salt marshes, clam flats, and barrier beaches with their dunes and rack lines on the shore. They look like miles of mud banks and salt marsh hay, but they are full of resources like these beach plums, which are on the leeward side of the dunes growing on Plum Island. The fruits are delicious to eat, but the leaves contain cyanide. The native people used them homeopathically to resuscitate people who had collapsed. In addition to extensive pharmacopoeias, the native medical practice included homeopathic treatments or sympathetic magic, in which like produces like. For example, using snake root to treat snake bite and cyanide to reverse a death-like state. Estuaries were just as important as wetlands and uplands for subsistence. During periods of seasonal migration to the coast, upon reaching their summer camps, the people would set their weirs and their surf nets and channel nets. They would plant their corn and their kitchen gardens, and then they would go fishing, clamming, crabbing, fowling, egg gathering, sealing, and plant gathering. They used clam juice with saltwater brine as a pickling and fermenting agent, and along with dried seaweed such as sea bean or glasswort to season to salt meat stews. Otherwise, did not have salt. They used salty things to flavor their stews. In estuary bioregions, they gathered plants and grasses that tolerate sandy or salty soil and grow along the shore, including native roses, such as Rosa virginianus. The one you most commonly see around here is not native, it's Rosa rugosa, which is an import. However, the rose hips are still just as nutritious, packed with nutrients and antioxidants and vitamin C. Rose blossoms are edible along with the rose hips. And native sumac, the staghorn sumac, is an all-purpose plant. All parts of it are edible in season, but it's full of oxalic acid and has to be rinsed in several changes of water to have the oxalic acid leached out. The Algonquians would dry and powder the sumac flowers and fruits to add to porridges and stews. They added dried sumac leaves to their smoking mixtures. The seed heads, flower heads, can be infused for tea. Also can be mixed with vegetable oils or animal fats to make an orange dye. American sea rocket, which is down here. American sea rocket is like lettuce, eaten young. It's delicious raw, but later on, when mature, its sap has a sedative and analgesic effect. Algonquians prized bearberry tea. They dried the leaves to add to smoking mixtures. Marsh elder or sumpweed is in the sunflower family, and it was cultivated for its edible seed and seed oil as early as 4,000 years ago, even before maize was brought to New England. Marsh elder is an allergen, however, and as soon as corn appeared on the scene, it replaced the grains from marsh elders as a staple crop. Mullein leaves are edible and were used in infusions to treat respiratory problems. Bay leaves and berries add flavor to meat stews. They also used bayberries along with juniper berries in their fermentation and pickling processes. They added goldenrod flowers to puddings to add flavor and color to them. And goldenrod also makes a yellow dye. Goldenrod, as you must know, is not the same as ragweed. Those are two completely different plants in two different families, two different biological families. In addition to the marsh elder, the people were cultivating chenopodiums. And these include all the plants that are in the family we usually refer to as goosefoot, including lambs, quarters, quinoa, and amaranth. Those are all chenopodiums. Chenopodiums have been found in the campsites of Paleo Indians more than 10,000 years ago. This was among the very first type of plant that Native people began to actually cultivate, which may very well be what led to its domestication. Dried seeds of marsh elder, goosefoot, and amaranth could be ground together as a flour to be used as a soup thickener or in baking. Amaranth also has medicinal properties. It's very high in vitamin C. People used infusions of the leaves and flowers to treat various ailments. Dried amaranth leaves were added to tobacco mixtures along with dried sumac leaves and shaved chokecherry bark and native nicotiana. There are two types of nicotiana that are native to New England. The chenopodiums and the plants in the sunflower family, like marsh elder and other sunflowers, they were the first food plants that indigenous people in North America domesticated and cultivated in their gardens. The Algonquians used estuary sedges and bulrushes and salt marsh hay and sweetgrass in their to make in their weavings, their basket making, and their making of cordage. You may recognize the sweetgrass in the lower right-hand corner because it's probably growing in your yard. Sweetgrass was gathered in the spring before it flowered. Then they would bundle it, soak it, wrap it in lengths, and then coil the lengths into baskets, lashing together the coils. And then the basket would help hold its shape when the grass is dried. The people also carried personal amulets containing sweetgrass and other dried medicinal herbs or sacred substances, including tobacco. This is one of the two native varieties of tobacco, Nicotiana alata. They're narrow-leaved. And these are some plants whose leaves and flowers were used in salads and herbal teas and also medicinally. Every part of the New England aster is edible. For example, the flowers, the leaves, and the roots. Jewelweed is a native orchid, and its flower makes a healing skin lotion. They would often add these flowers to animal fats or seed oils to make a salve to spread on the skin for skin problems. Fleabane was used to treat diarrhea, coughs, hemorrhages, eye strain, skin rashes, and women spread fleabane in their wigwams to discourage.
It's 11 o'clock.
And lice. So sorry about that. That's my computer giving the time. Are you still with me? Maybe half through. The people used St. John's wort for skin irritations and wounds. An infusion of the flowers was used to reduce anxiety. Depression in the modern sense was not a Native American diagnosis, however. Symptoms that we would call depression were regarded as spiritual conflicts or instances of spirit possession. So the treatment would be the administration of anti-anxiety drugs, including St. John's wort and native wild chamomile. And otherwise, healings were social and ceremonial, other than pharmaceutical. Medical practice was based on the metaphor of the medicine wheel as an expression of spiritual concepts relating to earth balance and spiritual health. The medicine wheel is a circle divided by stone rows, first into the four quadrants based on the four cardinal directions. That also includes a Mother Earth below, a Father Sky above, and in the middle is a spirit tree or a sacred fire or some other feature representing the Great Spirit. Special stones mark the cardinal directions and also the 12 or 13 lunar months around the perimeter. Each quadrant is associated with a season of the year, a color, a stage of life, a state of mind, and plants and animals that were emblematic of those things in that season. Native people marked the medicine wheel on the ground. The drawing you see was made in 1585 by an Englishman exploring in Virginia. It shows indigenous people dancing in a Thanksgiving celebration. The participants are holding key subsistence resources from harvests during one of the 7 months of the growing season. Some people today plant or design gardens as medicine wheels. They could be any size. Some people just plant flowers the color of each segment Others grow medicinal herbs, culinary herbs, and aromatics, matching the native themes of the places, of the spaces. Shamans traditionally relied on sage, cedar, tobacco, and sweetgrass as the four sacred plants. Traditional Algonquian healing involved the use of medicine wheels as well as the medicines. For example, a patient might be brought to the spiritually powerful center as part of the cure. So far, I've talked about plants on the basis of the bioregions in which they were found: wetland, upland, and estuary. In each bioregion, the people protected and maintained the habitats of the wild plants they depended on, which in some cases led to plant domestication. But now let me switch to some examples of seasonal rounds. The Algonquians here exploited the resources of the three bioregions in a systematic way based on seasonal changes in the life cycles of the plants and animals. Gathering and gardening were women's work and went on for at least 7 or 8 months of the year. Plants had, as you've seen, different uses at different times of the year and were revisited. So making a good living involved complex coordination and high mobility. And that is why the people here did not create permanent structures or cities like the Maya or the people of Mexico and Central America and South America. Even the villages were mobile because without fertilization, corn needs new ground to grow in every 2 or 3 years. It depletes the nitrogen of the soil. But the people were not wanderers or nomads. They simply moved within a territory, usually only about a 30 to 50 miles in diameter, coordinated between main villages, winter camps, and summer camps. Distances between main villages and seasonal camps were not far. For example, the Indians that came to Cape Ann had a winter village in Lowell called Wemisit. That's only about 30 miles away. And in the summers, they would come to Plum Island Sound, Essex Bay, and Gloucester Harbor and plant their summer gardens, their kitchen gardens. Well, this idealized calendar gives only a rough idea of what was involved in a seasonal round. So it's just giving a concept. Let's see if I can move this again out of the way. None of these activities is exclusive to any given month. And of course, all the day-to-day activities and household arts, such as processing food, curing hides, woodworking, stone knapping, and weaving, and so on, would have gone on all year. These are some examples of the resources people gathered in spring and summer. Some of the items had special uses. These are some of the many mushrooms that you can still harvest here. Fungi were 4-season crops starting in spring. As you know, you have to be knowledgeable about plant identification before embarking on any fungi exploration. But this area is very rich in a very wide variety. All of these varieties grow here on Cape Ann, along with the oyster mushrooms shown in the previous slide. Deer tongue leaves, wild onions or ramps, and fiddlehead ferns were on the spring menu. Salad greens such as early dock leaves and plantain leaves were gathered before the plants flowered, but there were no dandelions. Those were imported by the colonists as fodder for their cattle. Native dock leaves were collected. These young leaves are kind of lemony. They can be boiled, steamed, or sauteed like spinach. And the tap roots of dock can be cooked edible as a vegetable. This is the only variety of mint that is native to New England, Mentha canadensis. All the other kinds of mint that you see or buy in the garden center are imports. Native people used mint to relieve muscle cramps and as a decongestant and antiseptic and a stimulant. Plantain leaves and roots were eaten raw and cooked. A decoction of plantain leaves treated diarrhea. The leaves could be macerated for salves to put on cuts and abrasions. And then later in the season, the people would come back to collect the mature plantain seeds to mix with their other wild grains. So plantain, another important all-purpose plant. These are all edible native wild flowers, except for the cardinal flowers, which are poisonous. Algonquians used cardinal flowers medicinally to treat abscesses and to make their other remedies more potent. Women and children gathered these blossoms in baskets to add to salads, porridges, and stews. Believe it or not, you can trim the spines and sharp parts of the thistles and boil them to eat like a vegetable. You can also drink the juice they're boiled in as a tonic. Violet, clover, and primrose flowers are eaten raw, but the leaves and stems of the violet have to be boiled, rinsed, and then the best way to eat them is to fry them with fat and with other greens. The violas, especially Johnny jump-ups, were also used medicinally as poultices for boils and headaches, and as a tea for dysentery. Infusions of the pink lady slippers of the roots, which is another native orchid, now thoroughly endangered, were taken medicinally for gynecological issues, symptoms of venereal disease, urinary tract infection, kidney problems, stomach aches. Lady slipper root was also given to children to soothe their nerves, stop convulsions, and get rid of worms. These plants are protected now and should not be taken in the wild. Algonquians had stories about the plants they used. They referred to this, just giving this one example, they referred to the pink lady slippers as the moccasin flower for a legend in which a beautiful young woman runs away into the woods from a husband who is mistreating her. After days of wandering alone in the forest, she is discovered by a deer, a buck, and he invites her to join him. She leaves her moccasins at the side of the trail, trading them for hooves. She marries the buck and lives happily ever after as a doe and the founder of her species. Her husband never finds her, but he does find her slippers by the side of the trail. This is the reason that hunters traditionally asked spiritual permission to take a deer, to hunt a deer, because deer were regarded as part human and therefore kin. Another important root was ginger. And of course, our wild ginger roots don't look anything like the ginger that's in the supermarket. It has culinary uses, and the Algonquians used it medicinally against nausea, morning sickness, and muscle pain. The flowers and bulbs of native lilies are edible, but not the oriental lilies that are sold as daylilies, some of which are naturalized here. These are our native lilies in the Lilium family. And the inset shows the garlic-like bulbs of the wood lily, extremely nutritious, similar to garlic. Daucus pusillus and Daucus carota, or Queen Anne's lace, are both wild carrots, but Daucus carota is not native, it's an import. The pusillus variety is the one native to New England. It does still grow here along with other edible root crops. Just need to distinguish it from bishop's weed, which is not a carrot and not edible, and also an import, not native. The roots of Daucus taste like carrots or parsnips and have the same nutritional value. In late summer, the Algonquians would harvest edible lichen on the rocks here, also called rock tripe. This rock with rock tripe on it is here in Gloucester. They were not terribly nutritious, but they were stored as a remedy for hunger in case of a winter food shortage. And they were also given to the children to chew to hold them over between meals. Infusions of magnolia bark were taken for stomachache and cramps and diarrhea. A warm decoction of magnolia bark relieves sinus congestion and toothache. Jack in the pulpit, or Indian turnip, and pokeweed are poisonous plants. But like a lot of poisonous plants, parts of them are edible when collected at the right time of year and cooked and used in the right way. Jack in the pulpit is full of oxalic acid, and the berries are poisonous. But the corm or the root of the plant can be eaten when it's dried or cooked. Preparations of the root were also used medicinally to treat rheumatism. Pokeweed berries are a food of last resort for some birds, but those berries and the roots of the plant can kill you. Algonquians ate only the stems and the leaves of young pokeweed plants after boiling them in 3 changes of water and thoroughly rinsing them. So I imagine it would be a food of last resort for people as well. The leaves apparently taste like cooked spinach. Stems were peeled and before cooking and apparently taste like asparagus. I have not tried these. Poultices of pokeweed root were applied externally for skin diseases and rheumatism. These are some flowers and flowering ground covers that are native to New England and can still be found growing wild here as in your backyards and gardens also, although there are many non-native varieties of these plants that have been introduced as well. Some of these are very rare. Native varieties are very rare. For example, the phloxes and lupines that you see are non-native cultivars that have been naturalized. But if you wanted to create a native-themed flower garden, these would be the plants to use. Working on such a garden right now, planting such a garden right now, if I can ever pull it off. You can also grow native varieties of vegetables from stock from organic heirloom seed companies. You just need to keep in mind that so-called heirloom varieties, many of them really are European imports. As I mentioned, dandelions and even such common plants as asparagus, foxglove, and bleeding heart, and so on, are all imported plants. These are examples of flowers that the Algonquians used to make natural dyes as well as medicinal compounds. Echinacea or coneflower makes a green dye, but it's also a strong medicinal plant. Echinacea was used internally and externally to treat both viral and bacterial infections. It stimulates the immune system. Tick seed, a native coreopsis, has flowers that were used to make both tea and an orange dye. The roots of the tick seed were used in decoctions to treat diarrhea and as an emetic. These are some of the plants that indigenous artisans used to make inks and dyes. They painted colors onto their baskets and deerskins. They dyed porcupine quills and squirrel tails, and they painted and tattooed their skin also. These are fun to experiment with. My son-in-law and my granddaughters make inks from walnut husks and daylily flowers. I'm hoping to experiment with that more. So these are things that people gathered in the fall into winter. The illustration shows the Algonquian method of making maple syrup or birch syrup, syrup from any tree sap, really, which was done in late winter. Willow, birch, maple, and other saps were collected and boiled in hollowed logs. The method of boiling was to heat rocks in a fire and then to drop the hot rocks into the liquid to bring it to a boil. You can see in the illustration the young people carrying hot rocks back and forth from a fire to the pot, so to speak. They did have pots, but clay pots have to be extremely thick to boil volumes of water directly over a fire. So until they got metal pots from the colonists, they boiled water in hollowed logs or in animal bladders by dropping in hot rocks. Pretty ingenious, I think. Nut gathering was a family fall activity. The Algonquians knew the location of every nut tree in their area and they protected them. New England is home to many that are still found here. In addition to hickory nuts, also called pig nuts, favorites included black walnut, white walnuts, which are really called butternuts, hazelnuts, and chestnuts. American chestnuts are endangered now, but the Algonquians ate the roasted nuts and they used decoctions to treat coughs and to stimulate the heart. They added nuts to everything. They made nut puddings, they made nut butters. And so in addition to fruit leather, they invented Nutella. Here's the cattail fluff I mentioned earlier. This was burst to store as duff for fire starting. They also stuffed it into their moccasins for winter insulation. And they stuffed it into their cradle boards for diapering material for their babies. Stands of cattails are precious and milkweed as well. Cattails are increasingly rare because they're rapidly being replaced by Phragmites in our shrinking wetlands. If you happen to have wetland on your property, you could be doing humanity a great service to cultivate cattails and other wetland survival plants. It's me trying not to be too pessimistic. Chaga, winterberry, and partridge berry are about the only few plant edibles that can be collected in winter. Chaga is a really ugly looking black fungus that grows on paper birch trees. Native people harvested those crusts for winter drinks. It's very foul looking, but the inside of it can be chopped up and steeped in boiling water to make a very fortifying tea. So now that we have looked at some of the wild plants the Algonquian used, both by bioregion and by season, what about their domesticated plants that they grew along with their chenopodiums? Well, maize, of course, to start, or Indian corn. It was domesticated in northern Mexico as early as 8,000 years ago or more, and it was carried to the northeast via the Mississippian civilization by the Eastern Woodland Indians. It probably arrived in New England around 2,500 years ago. The people here in New England invented many varieties of corn, including popcorn. Corn requires 50-degree soil to germinate, and the Algonquians in New England bred early maturing varieties. They did this by saving the first ears to form at the bottom of the plant as seed corn for the following year. Pretty ingenious again, I think. Pumpkins, squashes, beans, and a type of melon similar to watermelon are native to New England, and the Algonquians grew them in their gardens. Crookneck yellow squash, a variety of zucchini, and acorn squashes are also native. Crooknecks often were grown as gourds rather than as food, as they made handy containers for carrying drinking water. The picture shows the famous New Hampshire sachem Passaconaway, who is noted for wearing a hat made from a squash gourd. Native bean plants include pinto, kidney, and pea beans. You can still find bean plants growing wild on Cape Ann, although it takes a while to find them. Nicotiana rustica is the other variety of tobacco that still grows wild in New England. Inhaling the smoke of tobacco mixtures was a spiritual practice. And I have no idea if they became as habituated as people have been in the modern era. But inhaling was a way to experience the divine, and exhaling smoke was a way to send a prayer to the Great Spirit. Every garden had a tobacco patch and Jerusalem artichokes. Colonists gave them that name because New England was supposed to be the New Jerusalem, and Samuel de Champlain had written that the tubers tasted like artichokes. They didn't taste like artichokes to me, but there you have it. The Algonquians grew other sunflowers as well. The common sunflower is native to New England. And sunflower seeds were roasted and ground to make a coffee-like beverage. The dried leaves were smoked, and the people hulled and crushed the seeds to add to dishes or to press for oil, like sunflower oil. The Algonquians practiced slash and burn agriculture, and then they planted in mounds between the stumps of the burned trees, which were eventually removed. The potash-rich mounds were raked up after each rainfall to increase depth and to conserve moisture in the soil. People did not use irrigation, so mounding and contour planting on hillsides perpendicular to groundwater flows was the only way they could really grow things. This picture shows preserved corn mounds in Wamisit, or at the old Indian reservation of Wamisit in Lowell, from around 1696 when the site was last abandoned. And the inset shows how constant scraping around a mound to heap it up after each rainfall compacts the ground between the mounds so that the field retains water, but the mounds remain moist but well drained. The people added crushed shell to the mounds to sweeten the soil if it was acid, or to stabilize the soil if it was sandy. Women would sprout the seed corn with clay in leather bags and then would plant the slips in the mounds as seedlings. This would reduce the risk of germination failure and also reduce the risk of damping off during cold nights. You know how our springtimes go. And then they would direct sow other seeds around the edges of the mound, especially squash and beans. This companion planting of squash and beans was known as the Three Sisters method. The beans had corn stalks to climb, and the squashes shaded the corn plant's roots. Contrary to popular belief, the Indians did not routinely fertilize with fish waste. When they did fertilize, they used lobster bodies and horseshoe crab bodies to fertilize. Sometimes if they had planted beside an alewife brook, they could use the alewife slurry to fertilize. But that was only done in emergencies because the fish attracted predators that would come and dig up the crop to get at the fish. So it was used only very strategically and only as needed. This is what a kitchen garden would have looked like at an Algonquian family summer camp. The poles across the entrance indicate that nobody's home. And they maybe went fishing in the stream that's right behind that row of trees. Slash and burn agriculture is destructive to the environment only when forests are clear cut. The Algonquians did not clear cut. They left windbreaks and they left groves. New ground had to be prepared constantly because of the needs of corn for fresh ground to grow in. And so the people were practicing mobile farming, moving crops to new locations this way and that, and then moving their houses to be nearer to their crops. The colonists often mistakenly thought that the Indians had abandoned their village when they had merely left their wigwams and made new ones in locations that were closer to wherever they had planted that year. Same village in a different place. They cultivated much more land than they planted, which colonists saw as wasteful and used as an excuse to appropriate the land. But the practice was to ensure fertile ground for future planting. The Indians also set controlled fires twice a year to clear the undergrowth in the surrounding forests. This created grassy habitats for deer, heaths for berry bushes, and burning also kept trails clear, sightlines clear for travel and safety and trade, also safety from enemy attacks. And as I mentioned, many explorers remarked on the vast stretches of open parkland all along the coast and river valleys that the Indians created and maintained through controlled burns. The Algonquians also selectively drained beaver ponds and planted in the rich lacustrine soil, but they couldn't plant on the floodplains here. Our rivers don't flood predictably and deposit new soil. They're apt to either flood catastrophically and erode soils away, and they also tend to dry up before the growing season is over. And of course, the tidal rivers, salt marshes, and freshwater swamps are places that do not support maize agriculture. Men cleared the land, but everything else to do with plants and crops was women's work. The women were the farmers and they were the gatherers. These are some examples of some of the tools the women used. Hafted stone hoe blades, trowels made from hafted clam shells, hen clams or surf clams, stone tools used for braiding kernels off of dried corn cobs, corn mills for grinding corn into flour, mortars and pestles. And there were other things. For example, moose antlers make very good shovels, rakes, hand plows, and clam forks. Samuel de Champlain made sketches of the native people he saw here on Cape in New England. The woman who is grinding corn in a hollowed tree trunk at H, he saw specifically here on Cape Ann. The other sketch shows the division of labor with the man as hunter and fisher, and the woman as the gardener and gatherer. That's a Jerusalem artichoke growing between them. This is what a hillside cornfield would have looked like. The women are harvesting green corn for the Green Corn Festival in July. Some of the squashes have been left on the ground to harden as gourds, to be hollowed out and used as water jugs. And the boy on the platform is doing his stint as a scarecrow. He has an arsenal of stones up there to throw at the crows. Later would be the fall harvest of the corn that was left on the stalks to dry, which would be stored over the winter and used in trade. These were some of the Algonquians' methods of food preparation and preservation. Food could be dried as meat jerky or pemmican, fish flakes, and fruit leathers. Dried clam meats were a very important trade item because it was a delicacy for inland people to have reconstituted clam. Sun drying was the first step in most of the preservation processes. They did not have alcoholic beverages, but they did eat fermented fruits, and rotten green corn was regarded as a delicacy, sort of a thousand-year-old egg type of thing. Fruit food could be cooked on heated rocks, in pots, in basket steamers, on the fire, barbecue style, so on. Um, and corn was the basic ingredient of most recipes. The native New England clam bake was built on layers. First, you put fire heated rocks in a pit in the sand on a beach. On top of the hot rocks, the first layer was damp seaweed to create steam. The second layer was clams or mussels or other shellfish. The third layer was chopped vegetables. The fourth layer was flat fish flakes. They preferred haddock or flounder, and also very thinly sliced meat. The fourth layer was lobsters and crabs. The fifth layer was, I'm actually reading it backwards here. The sixth layer was corn in the husk. And then the seventh layer on top would be another layer of damp seaweed. Then the whole mound would be covered with mats, sealing in the heat and the steam, effectively creating an oven. This kind of baking was done for community meals, for celebrations, and special occasions. Families competing for rank would often put on extravagant clam bakes. If you go online, it's really hard to find authentic native recipes, but just ignore or substitute for any recipes calling for non-native ingredients, including baking powder, baking soda, molasses, milk, cream, cheese, and cane sugar. Watch out for any recipes with the word Indian in them, because they often is not or not Native American in origin. For example, Indian pudding is British colonial, made with molasses and milk. The only thing Indian about it is the cornmeal on which it is based. These are some of the dishes. I have recipes for some of these dishes. If anybody has a specific request, I'll be glad to send it. But I hesitate to keep talking because it seems like it goes on and on here. There has to be, I could go on for another hour telling you the recipes. So that will be another thing. This etching is from a drawing that was made in the 1580s of an Algonquian couple in Virginia, and they're having a meal together. The artist captured their diet. Let me just move me out of the way here. They're eating a dish of beans, and beside them, left to right, is a gourd or a water jug, a tuber of some kind, his pipe for smoking tobacco, a couple of walnuts, a mackerel, some corn on the cob, and a clamshell. The English were very impressed with the natives' greater height and weight, and their muscles, as you can see, and also with their fitness. They ate better than the colonists in all seasons, at least while they had access to their land and their seasonal resource sites. The main difference is that they had no dairy products, and they ate many more calories in protein, fat, and organ meats than is recommended for us today. Europeans also admired native hairstyles. Fashionable English women of the 17th century sported bangs. And some of the noblemen started wearing scalp locks in imitation of Native Americans. I think the Mohawk hairdo came later. The Algonquians who lived here on Cape Ann looked more like this than the couple in Virginia. The man is standing, is wearing his winter coat. These people were photographed on the Abenaki reservation at Odanak in St. Francis, Quebec, around 1890. Many Pawtucket from Essex County found refuge in Odanak during the contact period. these pictures could just as easily have been taken on the Ipswich River or on the Annisquam River at the beginning of the 17th century. There are many books about native gardening, and three sisters gardening. So take your pick. I think nativeseeds.org has a very good tutorial. All of these books were written by Native Americans, except for the Hartung book. The first one is the most relevant to Cape Ann. Joseph Bruchac is Abenaki, and he includes folklore for the plants. Kavash is an ethnobotanist and also has books on healing ways and on medicine wheel gardens. And there are a lot of good foraging guides and field guides for finding and using edible plants in New England. That's all I have for you today. If you email me, I can send a plant list and a few recipes if you wish. And I'm also always glad to learn anything that you have to teach me about this subject. Well, thank you very much, and Happy New Year.